Hi, I'm Michelle Atkinson. I'm an environmental horticulture agent here in Manatee County. I work with landscape professionals. I work with the mobile irrigation lab and talk to a lot of folks about stormwater ponds. So I wanted to do a presentation about some things to think about stormwater ponds because there's a lot of questions out there. So I'm hoping that you will learn some new tricks and tips from this presentation. So first of all, most Floridians do not live on a lake. It's a stormwater pond. For selling purposes, they call them lakes, lakefront property, and a lot of people pay premium prices to live on lakefront property, but they're actually stormwater ponds. So what are stormwater ponds? Well, they're really man-made features, and they're often required by the water management district when communities are developed to be able to accommodate the water flows. So they help with water quantity, and they also help with water quality because they act as filters. So this is not a stormwater pond. This is what people expect their stormwater ponds to look like a lot of times, but this is never going to be what they look like. They are not lakes. They are not photoshopped, which looks like the left picture has probably been photoshopped, but the picture on the right is a lake, and in a lake up north. We're not going to have this here. These are ponds built to take on pollution. So they're not going to be that blue water. They're going to be typically dark in color. So why do we have stormwater ponds? Well, we have a lot of runoff that has pollution in it. So by urban areas, construction, we put in hard surfaces, we highly maintain our landscapes, we have gas and oil and things on the roads, and then when it rains, all of the water washes across these surfaces and enters into bodies of water. It used to enter directly into our rivers, like the Manatee River, the Braden River, the Intercoastal, the Gulf Bays, and we were having some major water quality issues. So we changed the way we started developing back in the late 70s and started to include these stormwater ponds. Now the water flows from these communities into a pond. The pollution is allowed to settle out of the water before it moves on into a natural body of water. So the Water Management District permits these, and the HOA is typically responsible. So again, I talked about settling out. So you see the inflow here, and then the pollutants can settle down to the bottom. So you have this sediment down at the bottom of your pond. The sediment often determines the life of the pond. So what that means is as the sediment builds up, the pond can't hold as much water, it doesn't function properly, and so you have to go in and dredge the pond. That's a very expensive process. So we want to try to extend the life of our pond as long as we can, and we can do that sometimes with plants. If we have erosion around the edges of the pond, that's going to add to that sediment. So the more erosion we have, the faster that pond sediment is going to build up and need to be dredged out. So who's responsible for our stormwater ponds? Well, typically it's the homeowners association, the condo association, the community development district, or the landowners. They are required in most cases for development to retain your surface water on your property, at least the first flush, they call it, where the real, the nutrient loading is, the most pollutions runs off in that first 1 inch of stormwater that comes off of a property. So they want that retained on site so that those nutrients or pollutants can settle out. But it is the HOA or COA or CDD's responsibility for the upkeep, the labor, to keep it up, and also to get it permitted. Permits are typically every 5 years. They need to be renewed. So what are some of the pollution concerns? Well, we do have some unwanted types of algae out in stormwater ponds, but there's also some algae that's not bad. There's actually some algae that benefits the water quality, but there's some forms of algae that are not good forms of algae. And so having the pollution running off in there, especially nutrient, can feed that algae. We want to try to keep a balance in these ponds, you know, just like in nature, most things are a balance. And we're trying to keep a balance in here. And so when we overload the ponds with pollution, especially in nutrient pollution, then that algae can really grow because now it has a food source. So if you have a lot of algae, we need to start looking at the sources of where the food's coming from to feed that algae. If we have a lot of algae, it can grow, which it's a plant and it needs oxygen. It'll pull oxygen out of the water, and that can reduce the amount of oxygen available for the fish and cause the fish kill. So we, you know, don't want excessive algae in our ponds because of that. A lot of people don't like the look of it or sometimes the smell of it either. So again, it's a balance, and we want the good kinds of algae growing and not the bad kinds. So other pollution concerns can be bacteria and other pathogens that can come off of pet waste. That picture, I know it's gross, but I was walking, looking at a stormwater pond, and there it was. And it's not uncommon to find these, we call them landmines, around stormwater ponds. And that just flows whenever it rains or irrigation comes on. It just pushes those pollutants right into the water. So we really want to be mindful to clean up after our pests. One of our researchers, Dr. Mary Lusk, is doing some research on the sources of nitrogen that are coming into stormwater ponds. And she had a hot spot in this one community. At one end of the stormwater pond, there was a lot of nitrogen coming in right there. And so they walked the pond and started looking for where the source was coming from. And someone had a Labrador retriever, and they weren't scooping their poop in their backyard. And so whenever it would rain or irrigation would run, it was pushing nitrogen into the pond. So what do you think? Is this algae good or bad? Well, that's actually a good amount of algae, and it's not a horrible kind of algae. That's a good amount. So that pond is telling me a bit of a story. It's telling me that there's some nutrient in that pond, and the algae is growing to try to take care of it. The algae will actually help the water quality because it's going to pull the nutrient out of the water to feed itself and grow. So if this pond were covered in algae, then I would say, no, that's not a good amount of algae. And what's the story? Where are all the nutrients coming from? That would tell me that, you know, there's a lot of inputs going into that pond. So this isn't a bad amount. And a lot of times we're recommending plants for so many reasons, but one of the reasons is that if there was some plants around this pond, you wouldn't probably notice that algae. It would blend right into the base of the plants, and you wouldn't notice it like you do when it's, you know, turf right to the water's edge. A lot of people see these types of plants around the edges of ponds and think that they're weeds and want to remove them. Sometimes they are actually part of the pond plan. They're called littoral plantings, and if you remove them, it's actually illegal for you to do that. So you know, you want to definitely identify what the plant is, talk to the homeowners association, talk to the maintenance companies before you remove any types of plants around the ponds. We definitely just wouldn't recommend it. Most of the ponds are in what is called common areas. If your home was built more recently, the common area is all around the pond. Some of the older subdivisions still have the pond banks as being part of the property lines, but the newer communities, all the pond edges are in the common areas of the pond so that they have more control over the edges in the pond. So sometimes it's not even your property to be removing plants from, but you definitely want to communicate and find out what those plants are before you would remove them. And in this case, those are rushes, and they're a good plant, beneficial. You can actually see right here, those little brown balls there are seed heads, and a lot of wildlife birds come and eat those seeds off of there, so they're a good plant. Oh, whoops, too far. Okay, so here's one of the ponds that I've been out to see, and you can see no plants, barren, turf to the water. It's low right now because it's probably fall, and so the water level's low. But look at the edges here on this pond, and look over here. You can see that we have some major erosion issues happening. These trees, the root systems are exposed, and now they're, in jeopardy of falling over. So what's happening? Well, it's a normal day. There's a little bit of wind, just a little breeze, which is causing wave action. You can see the waves here in the pond. So it's causing that wave action. And the waves hit the shoreline, and it causes the soil to move. What can happen then is when the water level is up, so in the summertime when we have our rains, the water level's up and it hits the turf, and it causes the soil to move under the turf. We call that undercutting. So it undercuts the turf, and then the turf will slough off, fall into the water, and then it happens back here, and then it happens back here, and it just keeps eroding back and back and back. So, this is a real problem. There's nothing stopping the waves from eroding the soil. And that's what plants can help us with, as we'll talk about in some further slides. So here's that same pond, and you can see that sloughing that I was talking about. You can see where it's been undercut here, and then look, it's just fallen in. See, it's fallen in there. So all of the soil is also moving into the pond, and that sediment then is building up very quickly. So this pond, may have to be dredged a lot sooner than what the life expectancy is supposed to be. Most ponds, they predict to be anywhere from 20 to 30 years before they need to be dredged. But if you have, heavy amounts of erosion, then it can occur much sooner than that. Or you can delay it. Sometimes you can delay that by being, better about erosion controls. So this pond on the right is actually out of Wisconsin, and I put this picture in to show you that it's not just in Florida that we have these issues, it's in other states too. And I hear a lot of times people come from up north and say, oh, we didn't have this. I don't think you had stormwater ponds to the volume that we have them here. You may have had some lakes or, some small ponds around, but I don't believe that they were used for water controls like they are in Florida. So it does happen in other places, as you can see here. But we just have a different environment here. We're Florida, lots of water, and we have to deal with that water. So here's a pond I was out at, and I want you to notice right here. What do you think this is right here? Well, that's a power pole, and those are the anchor lines for the power poles in the yellow case there, right there. And that power pole was not in that pond when it was originally put in the ground. So that pond was, the edge of that pond was more like here. And it has been eroding and eroding and eroding and eroding. And now this is a plant bed on someone's back porch. So you've got a back porch right here and then a plant bed, and you can see there's not much backyard left, and this plant soon will be falling into that water too. So, this is what happens. There's no plants around here to stop the wave action. So what happens is, again, this was a very still day. Actually, it was stinking hot when I was out there. So it was very calm and still, but even so, there's still a little ripple on that water. There tends to always be a little bit of a ripple on the water. And that, when we have any wind at all, it hits, undercuts this turf, and it sloughs off. Now think about it. If there were plants all along here, then the wave would hit the plant and it would diffuse the wave force, the wave action. It would diffuse it before it hit the shoreline. So it wouldn't come in at the same force that it would without plants there. Here's another one without plants, and in this case they called me out because they had this huge algae level and wanted to know what they could do, and I told them quit feeding the algae. Look, there are grass clippings right here sitting on top of the algae. Now grass clippings have nitrogen and phosphorus in them. We put fertilizer down in our yard, the plant takes it up, the turf takes it up, we cut it, and there's nitrogen and phosphorus and other nutrients that are in that turf blade. And then when it gets into water, it's like putting little bits of fertilizer in the water. And even if this turf isn't being fertilized, or this vegetation, I can see other things in there, but even if it's not being fertilized, it's still pulling nutrient from the ground. It still has nutrient in it. And then it's heading into the pond, where it's providing food for all this algae. This algae wouldn't grow if it didn't have food. So what we really need to discuss in this pond's case is, where's its food coming from? How can we slow down the food source? What can we do to prevent all of that nutrient getting in there, causing it to grow? So here's a situation, again, no plants right here, and you can see that sharp edge where it's eroding. But then look down here, we have plants. Look at how the edge goes out, and it's not eroding at least as quickly. It looks like it's not eroding, but at least as quickly. And then look at the edge here, nice and smooth. It's not that sharp drop off like it is here. So we're not experiencing as much erosion here. We've got plants. So the wave hits, it gets diffused before it hits the soil. So it's not washing all of that soil off like it is in this area. So again, with the, can I remove the weeds from my shoreline? Well, a lot of times we have plants there on purpose. There's a reason for those plants. One, it's a littoral planting that's required, or two, it's helping the pond. So plants can put oxygen into the water. They can filter out some of those nutrients and pollutants, but they also serve as a nursery for fish and other organisms. The little fish can get in here and hide from birds and bigger fish. So I've heard too many times about people that stock their ponds. Again, open ponds, no plants, turf to the edge. They go purchase a bunch of little fish, put them in there, and it's like fish in a barrel for the birds because they can see them everywhere and they can just pick them off. And so, I'll be told the story of, we paid a lot of money to stock our ponds and the fish just went away. Well, there was no place for them to hide. So if you can get some vegetation in there, then those fish can hide. They have a much better chance of surviving. And then you have, the fish that you want in the pond. We're also encouraging the plantings up on the shoreline. We call them shoreline vegetated buffer zones. So we encourage this shoreline planting because it can catch a lot of the pollutants before they go into the water. It runs through this area and catches it before it ends up in the water, especially grass clippings. Now you won't have grass clippings right up at the water's edge, and the grass clippings would have to move through this area prior to getting into the water. So this is a design now that we're encouraging, not just through the University of Florida, but the Manatee County Fertilizer Ordinance is encouraging it too, and we'll talk about that in a future slide. So Littoral Shelves, the Swift Mud, who is the Southwest Florida Water Management District, still has in their permanent language that littoral shelves are required. Now, as ponds are being re-permitted, a lot of times these areas aren't being addressed, and it's a third-party certifier. Engineers come out and certify it, and sometimes these ponds are getting recertified without the plants being present. But then SwiftMud occasionally comes along and audits the pond, so they actually send their folks out to look at the pond, and if the plants aren't there, they'll tell them they need to put the plants in. So sometimes you have these plants that are, or ponds that don't have any plants around them, and then they're made to put the plants in, and then the homeowners get upset and say, what happened? Why are there weeds now in my pond? What's going on? Because a lot of these plants, these littoral type plantings, do look a little weedy sometimes, and sometimes homeowners don't like the look of them. Sometimes they can be quite beautiful, but the pond permit language does still require this littoral planting, and it can be either around the pond itself at the pond edge, or there could be a shelf. And so this shelf would have to consist of 30% of the pond, which would be a low area in the pond. At least 30% of it would be shallow. And of that 30%, 85% should be planted. And that, again, its purpose is to help filter out these pollutants. It can also be a wildlife habitat. Our what's the bird? Sandhill crane. Sorry. Our sandhill cranes utilize these areas for nesting, and that's where they raise their little chicks in those areas. So this is a full littoral planting. This would not be really a shelf type planting. If there were a shelf, it may cover like this area right here would just all be plants, and then the rest of the pond wouldn't have plants necessarily. But in this case, they've got a full littoral planting all the way around the pond. It's dense, it's lush, it's helping with the erosion and helping with the water quality of this pond. Now, I'm not saying that your pond should look like this specifically. There's lots of different looks that you can achieve with plantings, but this is showing you that you can still have these plants and surface water. That's typically the fear of homeowners when we start talking about plants around ponds. They are afraid they're going to lose this surface water look, and people still like to look out at the water. So with a lot of things, prevention is key, and especially with water quality, prevention is key to help with our water quality issues. So we have this program called Florida Friendly Landscaping. Maybe you've heard of it. It's 9 principles, and out of these 9 principles, quite a few of them deal with water quality and stormwater ponds. So I'm really going to just focus on those principles, but here are 5 of the principles, and here are the other 4 to complete 9 principles. So we teach lots of classes on the different principles. I would invite you to attend some of our workshops where you can learn more about Florida Friendly Landscaping. So the first principle of Florida Friendly Landscaping is the right plant for the right place. And what this means is you need to do homework on your plants before you put them in your yard. What kind of conditions do you have? Do you have high pH soils? Do you have salt water intrusion in your well, or do you have reclaimed water that has some salt in it? If so, you need salt tolerant plants. Do you have full sun, shade? Is it wet? Is it dry? These are all things that need to be considered when you're choosing plants. So the goal is to try to match the plant's needs or what the plant wants to your site conditions. That way, the plant's happy. It's growing in conditions that it's accustomed to. When we try to force plants to grow in conditions that they're not accustomed to, we have problems. One example that I see very commonly planted is Ixora. And especially in these types of situations, like around this pool cage, very often there's Ixora planted there. Fortunately, this one's not. This is a good example. But Ixora has red flowers. They're tropical looking. They're quite beautiful, but they like a low pH soil. And in our builder fill soils, we typically find high pH soils. So the Ixoras don't want to be there. And what happens is we have to fertilize them with special fertilizers to get them the nutrients that they need. We have to adjust the pH temporarily so that they can take up the nutrients. And if we don't do this, then we end up with Ixoras that have these brown spots all over their leaves and start to decline, all because they're not really planted in the appropriate place. Now, we can still make them look pretty, but it's going to take a lot of maintenance and a lot of chemical application to do so. So we would recommend that you look for a plant that would be more appropriately suited for that condition, so you don't have to put all that fertilizer down and worry with it as much, something that will just kind of grow on its own. So when you do that, you reduce pesticide applications, fertilizer applications, and water applications. So reducing stormwater runoff is another principle that Florida-friendly landscaping talks about, because our stormwater runoff carries all of these pollutants to the bodies, to the stormwater ponds and other bodies of water. And so by reducing the runoff to begin with, that's going to reduce the pollution moving. So one of the things that we can do is down here, there's a picture of this downspout coming off of a rooftop going into a landscape bed. We typically see these directed straight onto driveways. So what happens is you've got your cars parked on the driveway, some grass clippings may end up there, oil leaks out maybe a little bit, leaf litter can end up there, and then we have this high volume of water coming off of the entire rooftop, down these gutters, straight onto the driveway, and it's pushing water very fast across the driveway, taking all of these pollutants with it right to the storm drain. Now, our storm drains don't typically look quite like this, and hopefully yours don't look like this at all with the amount of pollutants running in there, but the storm catchments that we have along the roads, they go straight into stormwater ponds. There is no filter on these catchments. They're just an open tube catching the water and shooting it right out into the stormwater pond. Some places up north, I think Colorado, has stormwater catchments. They need to use that stormwater because they have so little water, so they catch it and send it to a treatment plant and actually get it into their system. In Florida, we don't do that. All of our stormwater catchments goes into another body of water. So it's either going to go into a stormwater pond, or if you're in West Bradenton, many of the older development areas, we weren't utilizing stormwater ponds then, so they go directly into Palmasola Bay, the Intercoastal, Manatee River. They'll go, directly in from the roadway. This is a picture of some fertilizer. You can see right here, these little blue granules are fertilizer granules. And what's happened is they fertilized the turf, and fertilizer got out onto the hard surfaces, the road or the driveway, and they blew it back, which is what we tell them to do, blow it back. But in this case, it gathered right here at the edge. And so now all it takes is some wind or rain or irrigation to run, to push that right out onto this hard surface and down the stormwater drains and then into the ponds or the intercoastal, the rivers, into these bodies of water. So we need to be really careful. In this case, this was probably improperly applied fertilizer. They were supposed to have used a deflector shield to keep that amount of fertilizer from going onto the hard surface in the first place. So I would bet you that no deflector shield was used, which caused this large amount to go onto hard surface that they had to blow back. So had they used a deflector shield, not that much fertilizer would be accumulated there. And then we have grass clippings. This is a real problem because, this turf has nutrient in it. And so when it ends up in water, it's like putting a little bit of fertilizer in the water. So we definitely want to blow these back, not leave these on the ground like this. These were actually left here. That's why I was taking pictures of them. And this road drains, the Manatee River is right back behind here. And so this road pretty much drains back into the Manatee River. A couple of spots now with improvements, they've put some storm ponds in, but in the older areas, it still flows right into the river. So this isn't a good scenario, and we want to take care of that. And here's grass turf growing around the stormwater pond, and evidently it had rained and they weren't able to mow, so it got rather tall, and now they've mowed it. So where do you think all these cuttings are going to go? Well, here they are, right in the water, and it doesn't take long before this starts to happen, and this is our algae starting to grow. So we can help protect our waterfront, and this is, again, another one of those Florida-friendly landscaping principles, but in this case, we're going to talk about the stormwater pond fronts, waterfronts. And so by keeping a maintenance-free zone of at least 10 feet, and when we say maintenance-free, this is a green industry best management practice. We call it the ring of responsibility, and it really isn't maintenance-free. It's chemical-free is what we really should say. So no fertilizer or pesticides should be applied to these areas, but there's still going to have to be some maintenance done in these areas, right? But we want to do our best to keep any grass clippings from getting into the stormwater drains or into the pond themselves. So we're going to direct, if we, some of them still have the blowers or the chutes that blow off to the side with their mowers, those would be directed away from the pond. Anymore though, most of them have what we call mulching deck mowers, so it just cuts and drops right in place. A lot of times they're using weed eaters close to the pond because it's safer. It's really dangerous for the guys to get around the pond edge on these big mowers because of that undercutting of the turf that we talked about earlier. When that happens and those tires hit that hole essentially that's covered up with turf that they can't see, it can put their mower in the pond. They can slide in or they can slip in, and it becomes a real problem. So protecting the water front is really important. But we're also going to encourage a planting zone around the pond. So not just the plants in the pond, but something that we encourage is a maintenance-free, again, it's really not totally maintenance-free, but a maintenance-free zone of at least 6 feet. And this is recommended in our county fertilizer ordinance. It is voluntary, but it is a recommendation that's made. And so what we're trying to do is keep back 6 feet off the pond so that when we do mow, all of these grass clippings now would have to flow through here prior to reaching the water. And they're probably going to get caught by these plants and not make it to the water. And that's the goal. These plants have deep root systems, so they're, should be able to hold the pond bank better. And so you would have a lot less maintenance in these areas, but you still would need to pull weeds, so it's not totally maintenance free. Now this can be accomplished a couple of ways, this 6 foot zone. In this case, we've got some plants planted, but in this case, we're showing that you can also just leave turf to grow. So just come back off of the pond 6 feet and not mow that area. And people get upset, what, not mow that area? If you have St. Augustine and a good band of St. Augustine around your pond, St. Augustine only grows up to be about 12 to 18 inches tall. It doesn't look bad if you just let it grow. The problem can be is if you don't have just turf in these areas. If you have weeds in these areas, then the weeds grow up, and that's what looks bad. It's not the turf that looks bad. Or if you have a problematic grass called torpedo grass, it can get very large and be very problematic. So before you just say, okay, we're going to quit mowing around the ponds, you need to be sure that you have a good amount of healthy turf, St. Augustine, Bahia, around the pond so that it still looks good. Bahia, same thing, it only gets to be 12 to 18 inches tall. So it doesn't look bad if you just let it grow. It is something to get accustomed to. I will say that. It's not going to be your typical mowed turf look, but it doesn't look bad. So here's another example of some plants. Now we've just planted these plants. They haven't filled in yet. Once they fill in, then it will really prevent weeds from being able to grow here because it's going to block the light availability to those weeds. We did use pine straw to try to reduce weeds in the meantime. Pine straw can mat down, it kind of interlocks with itself so it doesn't run off into the pond like other mulches could do. So you can see we've planted some aquatic plants here, and then we also planted the shoreline plants here. The funny thing was, this is out in Lakewood Ranch, and we had been working with them for quite some time trying to get them to adopt plantings around their ponds, and the homeowners didn't want them. They were very afraid that the plants would grow too tall, go out in the water too far, and they wouldn't have their waterfront views anymore. So we finally, unfortunately, gave up working with homeowners and went with the Interdistrict Authority. So this pond, as you can see, is really just common area. There's a road there, there's a road here, there's a road on this other side. So the majority of this pond, and especially where we planted, is only common area with no homes backed up to it. And so when we planted, it was that day that the plants went in the ground that other homeowners in the area were calling saying, we want plants around our ponds. We want our ponds to look just like that one. So, you know, here for years, we've been trying to get them to adopt it and do it themselves. And they had to see it. I don't think that they understood what we were talking about specifically, but now it's being appreciated out there. Folks are really enjoying the plants. There's more wildlife in the area, more color, and they're really happy with it. So like most things, maintenance is key, and you can have a gorgeous Florida-friendly landscape with, you know, appropriately selected plants for the site conditions. But if you continue to put down a lot of fertilizer, a lot of water, a lot of pesticides, then it's really not Florida friendly. So maintenance is really key. So we want to be sure that we're really only applying things when we need to. We're not spraying pesticides every month because it's the 15th of the month. We're only applying when we have a pest problem that needs to be addressed. And we're only applying fertilizer when our plants are showing that they need some fertilization. And we're only applying water when our plants are showing us that they need water. And our irrigation systems aren't running constantly, even through the rainy season, that we have working rain sensors, because all that irrigation pushes water off into the stormwater ponds, which is going to push pollutants there as well. So when we're talking about plants, we did some research again with homeowners and had them what we call order plants. So we gave them like 20 plants to choose from and said, okay, put your least favorite on this end and your most favorite on this end. And so we chose the top selected plants to come up with some designs. And Gail Hansen, who's one of the researchers at University of Florida, developed this. It's a stormwater pond plant selection guide and design guide. So some of the plants that we would recommend would be rushes. They do very well and they make a nice backdrop, green backdrop, to plant other plants like these purple pickler weeds or duck potato with their little white flowers. Cannas are okay in some areas. I wouldn't put it right behind a homeowner's house because there's a season that they don't look very good. There's a season that they look great with flowers, but there's also a season that they don't look very good. So having those maybe on a backside that borders a conservation easement or a natural area, you don't notice that season. You just notice when they're very colorful and pretty. So they're a nice plant too. Blue flag iris is nice. But the water lilies, you have to be careful with, because if you don't have a deep pond, they can take over the whole surface of the pond. Water lilies won't grow past about 10 to 12 foot depth. But if you have a pond that is 10 feet at the deepest, then the water lily can keep growing and take over the whole surface. So I wouldn't really recommend the water lily in those ponds, because homeowners tend to want to see some surface water, and they wouldn't be able to see that once the pond lily had totally grown in, or you would have a higher maintenance level trying to keep them removed. Then we have that vegetative buffer zone area, the slope bank or bank slope zone here, they got it called. And here's some plants that work well there. So we've got some of the Fakahatchee grass, muley grass, some of our, spreading shrubbier plants like scorpion tail and the blue mist flower, which is a lower growing plant, porterweed, African iris, and then some vines, passion vine. Some ground covers are good in these areas too. So here's what some of the designs look like. And in this case, we're showing a ground cover type design and then aquatic plants in the water. And you can see here that they've actually put the plant, design in, naming the plant so it can be replicated. And here is that no-mow zone again, just letting the turf grow. Again, you need aquatic plants here so that when the wave comes in, it can diffuse the energy of the wave, make it so it doesn't erode the shoreline as badly as if it were just hitting that shoreline straight on. So again, here are the plant names and design that you could mimic in your own backyard, and then the no-mow turf strip here. So this is the pond I've showed here a couple of times, and a couple of our researchers that we've been working on this pond with. This is in the season, in the fall season, and so the water level is pretty low. But now we've come in and planted it with plants, and we've planted the aquatics here. So this fall, when the water level drops, this area will have plants in it. It'll be those littoral shelf plantings, and they don't have to always be submerged in the water like this, or we call them emergent, but they don't have to have water at the base all the time. They will survive in these drier periods. Now, they wouldn't survive there all the time, but they're accustomed to a dry season and a wet season, so they will withstand that. Here's another example of, you can see these were just planted here. These are a little more established in this area. This planting is more established, and then we've planted on the bank back there. We've got some water lilies here, but this pond is pretty deep out here, so those water lilies are not going to encroach on that surface water. Something that we did find in some of our research is that folks like to see these trees reflected in the water. They like to see surface water, and they like a look of maintenance. They like it to look kind of like a park-like setting. They do not like kind of the wild and wilderness look of a pond. They want it to be more of a look of maintenance. This is a natural pond, a naturally occurring pond up in North Florida. And you can see there are plants that grow around these pond edges, just out in nature. That's how things happen. So aquatic plants, pickler weed again is a pretty one. It's that purple flower, so it adds a little color. It gets some pollinators that come on it as well. It's a nice plant to utilize. Blue flag iris is a pretty one. Folks like that, the iris. And then duck potato, Sagittarius, has a white flower. Then we have our rushes, spike rush. You can see some of it was just recently planted. It'll kind of fill in this area here, but it's deeper out here, so it's not going to grow out too deep. For the water lily, this is the one that you do need to be careful with. This pond you can see is shallow in a lot of areas because the water lily's kind of grown way out here. So this must be a deep spot right there where it can't grow in. Again, if your pond is shallow, then water lily may not be the best plant for you because it's going to come at a higher maintenance cost. Shoreline plants. This is milkweed we utilized in one of the ponds, and the homeowners really like it for the color. Pollinators are attracted to this. This is one that was on a hardened shoreline area, and it's the blanket flower, which is this red, the gaillardia or blanket flower, and then the beach sunflower. So this will all grow in and creep together, again, utilizing pine straw to try to keep weeds out until it all creeps together. But this would all creep together in a very colorful ground cover edge. In this case, we used porterweed, flax lily, and muhly grass. It's kind of a nice combination with some diversity. And something that you will want to do before you move forward with planting plants is you'll need to talk with your pond maintenance company, and you'll need to talk with your landscape maintenance company. So the pond maintenance company, if they see something starting to grow all of a sudden, they may spray it in this area because that's what they're accustomed to doing if you're keeping your banks clear. So you would need to talk with them and work with them to put the plants in so that they would not spray them. And then the landscape maintenance company is typically going to maintain this area. So you would need to talk with them because as we get in this area, it gets a little tricky as to who's going to maintain it. sometimes the landscape maintenance company believes that it's close to the pond, so pond maintenance should be responsible for it. And pond maintenance says, well, it's not water, so landscape maintenance should be responsible for it. So before you install these types of plants, you definitely need to talk with both parties and have an agreement as to how they're going to be maintained. In this shoreline, they just utilized one type of ornamental grass. It's working. However, we like diversity, mainly for the reason of if there was a disease to come into this area that affected that grass, it would take out all of their plantings, most likely before they could get it under control. If you have some diversity, it gives you a chance to get things under control before it moves down the line. It also wouldn't take out the whole shoreline. You would likely have plants that could tolerate or wouldn't be affected by the disease or bug or whatever it is that comes in. So typically as a whole, we do not encourage monocultures of anything. And that would be true along the shoreline as well. So again, I'm Michelle Atkinson. I'm the environmental horticulture agent here in Manatee County. I do talk with folks in homeowners associations and stormwater pond committees about their stormwater ponds, but hopefully I've given you some information that you can talk about ponds with folks now, and I would encourage you to share this information, share the link, but I'm also happy to come out and talk with people about it as well. So thank you for listening.